On March 27, 1977, two young men carrying a handbag entered Las Palmas Airport in the Canary Islands. After entering, they headed straight to a shop and quietly placed the seemingly harmless bag in a hidden corner of the store, then quickly left the airport. No one could have expected that this small act would trigger a chain of tragic events, changing the fate of 583 families and marking a tragedy unprecedented in aviation history. At 7:24 Universal Time Coordinated, Pan American Flight 1736 took off an hour late from JFK Airport in New York. On board the flight were 378 passengers and 16 crew members. The plane had departed from Los Angeles, with a stopover in New York for refueling and picking up passengers, before heading to Las Palmas Airport in the Canary Islands. It was a Boeing 747-100, the very first 747 delivered, for use by a commercial airline, with its maiden flight on January 22, 1970. Just a few months later, on August 2nd of the same year, the aircraft was hijacked and forced to fly to Cuba, becoming the first 747 in history to experience such an incident. In New York, the crew of Flight 1736 was replaced. The new captain was Victor Grubbs, who had over 20,000 flight hours, along with First Officer Robert Bragg and Flight Engineer George Warrens. All three were founding members of the Pan Am, Boeing's 747 flight team, with an impressive level of experience. About an hour after the Pan Am flight took off, KLM Royal Dutch Airlines Flight 4805 departed from Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. This was a chartered flight, organized by a Dutch international travel company. Its destination was also Las Palmas Airport. On board were 235 passengers and 14 crew members. The flight was commanded by Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, who had logged over 11,700 flight hours. He was also the chief instructor for KLM's 747 fleet, and a public figure, featured in the airline's advertisements, and appeared in many magazines. A famous captain. Flying with him was young First Officer Klaus Mers and Chief Flight Engineer William Schroeder, who was also the president of the Flight Engineers Association. After a 3-hour journey, KLM Flight 4805 began its descent, preparing to land at Las Palmas. But the wheels of fate had begun to turn. An explosion suddenly pulled both aircraft, seemingly unrelated, into the same tragedy, exactly at 1300 hours Universal Time Coordinated. An employee at Las Palmas Airport received a phone call. "I represent the group NBAIC. We have placed several bombs inside your terminal. You have 15." After the call, authorities immediately began evacuating passengers from the airport. At 13:15, the bag left in the store suddenly exploded. At that moment, KLM Flight 4805 was only about 20 minutes from Las Palmas, because in the phone call, the bomber had used plural form when referring to the explosive devices. Security forces at Las Palmas decided to shut down the airport until a second bomb could be located. Upon receiving this information, the KLM flight, which was circling in a holding pattern, immediately diverted to Tenerife Airport, about 110 kilometers away for an emergency landing. As KLM diverted, Pan Am Flight 1736 had also arrived in Las Palmas airspace. Because it was carrying a large amount of fuel, Captain Grubbs wanted to keep circling in the air while waiting for the airport to reopen. However, air traffic control denied this request, stating that no aircraft were allowed to fly in the surrounding area. With no other option, Captain Grubbs was forced to divert and land at Tenerife as well. At 13:38, the KLM flight landed at Tenerife Airport. Due to the explosion at Las Palmas, many other flights were also diverted there. Tenerife Airport quickly became overcrowded. KLM was instructed to temporarily park on the Western Taxiway because the main parking area was completely full. About 37 minutes later, the Pan Am flight also landed in Tenerife and was directed to park just behind a SATA DC-8 aircraft from Switzerland. This Western Taxiway had become a temporary parking zone with a total of 5 aircraft, originally scheduled to land at Las Palmas. While waiting, KLM's Captain Van Zanten asked passengers to remain seated on board while awaiting clearance to take off. But after 20 minutes passed, Las Palmas Airport still had no notice of reopening. Eventually, KLM passengers were allowed to disembark and take buses into the terminal to rest. Pan Am made a similar request to let passengers disembark and rest, but was denied because the terminal was already overcrowded. With no other option, the passengers had to take turns standing on the boarding stairs to stretch their legs and get some fresh air. Understanding the passengers' discomfort, Captain Grubbs invited small groups into the cockpit for a tour. He and his colleagues gave a thorough introduction to the modern cockpit of the Boeing 747, one of the most advanced aircraft of its time. The atmosphere inside the Pan Am cockpit was light and friendly, in stark contrast to the KLM cockpit, which was filled with tension. Captain Van Zanten and Chief Engineer Schroeder began worrying about exceeding duty hours. Previously in the Netherlands, captains were allowed to decide to extend crew duty hours to complete a flight. However, that regulation had changed not long before this incident occurred. If caught violating it, the flight crew could be penalized with license revocation or even face jail time. After discussing with the crew, Captain Van Zanten decided to refuel an additional 55 tons at the airport in Tenerife. He believed that instead of waiting for Las Palmas to reopen, it was better to fully refuel, so that after flying to Las Palmas and dropping off passengers, they could return to Amsterdam without needing to stop again for fuel. But in reality, the remaining fuel on board was already enough to fly from Las Palmas back to Amsterdam. However, adding 55 tons of fuel significantly increased the aircraft's weight, which meant that the runway length required for takeoff would also be longer. A series of uncertainties and pressure over exceeding duty hours put Captain Van Zanten under intense mental stress. That mindset led him to a decision that seemed reasonable but brought unimaginable consequences. Just a few minutes after KLM began refueling, Las Palmas Airport officially announced it had reopened. Flights diverted to Tenerife began requesting clearance to resume their original routes. Pan Am immediately contacted the control tower to request takeoff. However, the KLM aircraft was parked directly in front and still refueling, blocking the path. Upon learning that KLM's refueling would take another 30 minutes, Pan Am's Captain Grubbs asked his crew to get out and measure to see if the aircraft could maneuver through the side gap to reach the runway. After measuring on site, they discovered that the distance between the KLM aircraft and the edge of the taxiway was less than the safety margin by about 6 meters, roughly 20 feet. Therefore, Pan Am was forced to wait for KLM to finish refueling. As both flight crews waited, what they feared most finally happened. Tenerife is one of the largest islands in the Canary Islands, home to Mount Tide, rising 3,117 meters high, situated in the center of the island. The presence of this mountain range creates a unique weather phenomenon. When moisture from the Atlantic moves southward, it is blocked and forced upward by the mountainous terrain, forming thick orographic clouds. Due to this feature, the northern area of Tenerife, where the airport is located, is frequently covered by damp cloud layers. Tenerife Airport is located on the northern slope, at an altitude of about 633 meters, which makes it particularly vulnerable to shifting cloud formations and unpredictable weather. From its inauguration to 1977, Tenerife Airport had recorded 7 serious accidents. To address the severe weather conditions, local authorities built a new airport in the southern part of the island, where the climate is drier and visibility is better. However, at the time of the incident, the new airport had not yet been put into operation for several reasons. Although when landing, the weather at the airport was still relatively clear. By the afternoon, thick clouds had covered the entire area. Unlike fog, which is calm and clings close to the ground, these orographic clouds and disappeared unpredictably, causing runway visibility to change continuously, posing great difficulty for pilots. At 16:45, refueling for the KLM aircraft was finally completed. Passengers began boarding the plane again, except for a female tour guide named Rabina, who lived right in Tenerife, and decided to leave the airport and not continue the flight. In total, 234 passengers returned to the plane, preparing to fly to Las Palmas as originally planned. Seeing the sky grow darker and darker, Captain Van Zanten became increasingly concerned. If visibility on the runway dropped below the allowable limit, they might have to delay takeoff again. Therefore, he requested to start the engines as quickly as possible. At 16:58, the first officer began contacting Tenerife Air Traffic Control to request taxi clearance to the runway. The first officer of KLM Flight 4805 contacted Tenerife Approach Control. Approach, this is KLM 4805, on the ground at Tenerife Airport. Due to a tailwind at the end of runway 12, the aircraft couldn't take off directly from that position. The KLM crew requested to back taxi along the runway and take off from the opposite end, runway 30. Roger that. KLM 4805, taxi onto runway 12, then exit via the third taxiway and turn left onto the taxiway. Proceed to runway 30 and hold for takeoff. Due to congestion at Tenerife Airport, aircraft were lining up across the entire taxi area. So ATC planned for KLM to enter the runway, then turn left at taxiway C3 and continue to runway 30 for departure. However, due to the controller's heavy Spanish accent, the KLM crew misheard the instruction and thought they were to turn at the first taxiway instead of the third one. After the first officer repeated it incorrectly, the controller revised the instruction and corrected it. KLM 4805. Continue taxi to the end of the runway, then turn around. As the plane approached the first taxiway, C1, the first officer asked again, "Confirm please. Should we turn left at taxiway C1? No. Continue straight to the end of the runway and turn around." The controller replied quickly. At this point, due to unclear English and radio communication interference, both flight crews, KLM and Pan Am, had difficulty hearing the instructions. Meanwhile, ATC radioed to Pan Am. Pan Am 1736. Your aircraft is on the left side of the runway, near the third taxiway. Sorry, say again please. Pan Am 1736. You're near the third exit on the left side. Exit the runway there. We turn left at the first exit, correct? No. The third one. The third exit. Switch to frequency 119.7. Due to complex communication and low visibility from the fog, Pan Am Captain Grubbs planned to wait until KLM took off before. However, this intention hadn't yet been reported to the tower. Before they were switched to a different frequency, the approach frequency, we were instructed to contact you and continue taxiing on the runway. Correct? Affirmative. Enter the runway and taxi to your third exit on the left. Unlike KLM, Pan Am was instructed to move along the runway and exit at taxiway C3, then turn toward runway 30. The purpose was likely to reduce the time Pan Am occupied the runway. However, to exit at C3 and turn onto the taxiway toward runway 30, the aircraft had to make two 148-degree turns. First, a 148-degree left turn, then a 148-degree right turn. For a Boeing 747, a heavy-class aircraft, the second turn was nearly impossible. The aircraft's nose gear would go off the taxiway due to lack of turning space. The Pan Am crew felt confused and questioned the controller's instruction. Why are we being directed this way? In reality, Tenerife was only a regional-class airport, and on that day, only two controllers were on duty. The large number of diverted aircraft overwhelmed the two men. Ground and air traffic coordination, which should have been handled by the control tower, was instead shifted to the approach team, who were only responsible for handling aircraft entering and exiting airspace. Crucially, the approach controller was unaware of the limitations in maneuvering a large aircraft like the Boeing 747. To exit at taxiway C3, the Boeing 747 needed to make two wide turns. The Pan Am crew confirmed again with ATC. Please confirm, sir. You want us to exit at the third taxiway on the left, right? Correct. Yes, the third taxiway. 1, 2, 3, the third one. Got it, thanks. After confirming clearly that they would exit the runway at the third exit, C3, the Pan Am crew began conducting their pre-takeoff checklist. The cockpit atmosphere was very relaxed. The flight engineer even joked in Spanish. 1, 2, 3. That's right, we're almost there. However, in stark contrast, inside the KLM cockpit, a tense silence hung in the air. The aircraft had just emerged from a thick cloud layer. Captain Van Zanten turned off the wipers as soon as Pan Am confirmed exiting at C3. With the controller, the entire KLM crew listened closely to the exchange. They were using the same radio frequency as Pan Am 1736. "Let us know when you've cleared the runway," the controller instructed. However, instead of using the standard phrase "runway vacated," the Pan Am crew simply replied, "Pan Am 1736. This non-standard reply may have led Captain Van Zanten to mistakenly believe that the Pan Am aircraft had vacated the runway. But in reality, at that moment, the Pan Am aircraft had only just reached the sample taxiway, a location forming a 90-degree angle with the runway. It's a 90-degree angle. Exactly, a thick layer of clouds still blanketed due to visibility being zero in all zones, and the airport lacking a ground surveillance radar system. Controllers could only rely on radio communication to determine aircraft positions. KLM 4805, how many exits have you passed? We believe we just passed Sabanro. Continue to the end of the runway, turn 180 degrees, then wait for takeoff clearance. At Pan Am's position, visibility was extremely poor. They were taxiing slowly at about 8 to 10 knots, which equals roughly 10 to 11.5 kilometers per hour. Meanwhile, about 2 meters away, the KLM aircraft had completed its turnaround and was lined up for takeoff. At KLM's position, visibility had temporarily improved compared to earlier. However, all three key parties, KLM, Pan Am, and the control tower, still couldn't see one another. A longer cloud bank was rapidly approaching at 17. KLM completed its turn. Captain Van Zanten believed that Pan Am had vacated the runway and began pushing the throttle for takeoff. However, the first officer immediately spoke up. "Wait, we haven't received takeoff clearance yet." "I know. I'm requesting it now," Van Zanten replied. "KLM 4805 is ready for takeoff, awaiting clearance." The first officer called the tower. At that moment, the Pan Am aircraft was just a few dozen meters away from taxiway C3, the point where they were supposed to turn left to exit the runway. The controller began issuing the flight route to KLM after takeoff. These instructions were crucial to the Pan Am crew, since it was their first time flying into Tenerife, and they would rely on this information to gauge when the KLM aircraft would lift off the runway. At this point, Captain Grubbs' attention, who was directly piloting the Pan Am aircraft, began to drift. In the extremely low visibility conditions, the Pan Am crew could not clearly see signs or runway markings. As a result, they missed taxiway C3, where they were supposed to turn left to exit the runway, and continued moving forward, drawing closer to the KLM aircraft. At 17 hours 5 minutes and 53 seconds, the controller transmitted to KLM 4805, mistakenly saying KLM 8705, cleared to fly to point P, navigation reference point via VOR, climb to FL90, which equals 9,000. After takeoff, turn right to heading 040. Maintain that heading until intercepting the radial 325 from Las Palmas VOR station. It is important to note this was a route clearance after takeoff, not a takeoff clearance. However, due to time pressure and the psychological urge to leave the ground as soon as possible, Captain Van Zanten misunderstood it as permission to take off immediately. As the first officer was repeating the instruction to confirm it, Captain Van Zanten suddenly pushed the throttle hard, beginning to accelerate the plane. Although he sensed something was off, the first officer was bound by a habit of deferring to authority and didn't strongly object to the captain. Instead, while repeating the controller's instruction, he quietly added one sentence: "We are taking off," a subtle way to signal on the frequency that the KLM aircraft was beginning its takeoff roll, in hopes that anyone still on the runway would realize and react in time. "Roger, proceed to point P. Turn to heading 040 until intercepting radial 325. We are taking off." However, the control tower couldn't hear the full message due to interference, and assumed KLM was still waiting for takeoff clearance. Right after, the controller added, "Wait for my instructions before taking off." 2 seconds later, he stressed again, "Please wait. I will call you for takeoff." At that moment, an unexpected situation occurred, as if the final P The tragedy had just fallen into place. Pan Am was still on the runway, and immediately realized KLM had truly begun takeoff. Pan Am's first officer broadcasted on the same frequency. "We're still on the runway. This is Clipper 1736. This was a crucial warning. Enough to stop KLM if they had heard it. But unfortunately, something went wrong. The signals from Pan Am and the controller were transmitted simultaneously, causing radio interference. Inside KLM's cockpit, the crew only heard a brief phrase, "Okay." That vague, "okay," made Captain Van Zanten firmly believe they had received clearance to take off, and he continued to accelerate. Since radio interference only affects the transmission, the sender can't hear the garbled sound caused. The controller assumed KLM had heard the instruction to wait, so the controller switched to instruct Pan Am. "PA 1736, report when you're clear of the runway." "Roger, we will report when we're clear of the runway," Pan Am's first officer replied. Notably, in this exchange, the controller referred to Pan Am as PA, using the airline code abbreviation, instead of the usual Clipper call sign. This change in address may have caused Captain Grubbs and the first officer, who were highly focused on piloting, to miss that the message was directed at them. Only Flight Engineer Riedel, sitting in the rear, noticed something odd in the exchange. He spoke up. "Did he just say we were clear of the runway?" "What? Pan Am's off the runway already." "Of course," Van Zanten replied with certainty. In his mind, KLM had received takeoff clearance, and everything was going according to plan. Without hesitation, he continued to accelerate straight ahead, toward where Pan Am had not yet cleared the runway. Inside Pan Am's cockpit, the crew had no idea that KLM was speeding directly toward them. They were still grumbling about the delay, caused by KLM refueling earlier. "Come on, let's get the hell out of here already." "Yeah, he's in a rush now. He's the one who made us over an hour and a half late." "Exactly. And now he's the one in a hurry." Before they could finish, Captain Grubbs suddenly saw headlights straight from the nose of KLM. The entire crew froze in shock, realizing danger was imminent. "There it is. That's him." Grubbs immediately turned the plane off the runway to avoid the collision. But weighing over 300 tons, a Boeing 747 can't accelerate fast enough to evade. At the same time, Captain Van Zanten of KLM also saw Pan Am. He pulled hard on the yoke to take off earlier than scheduled. But at that moment, the aircraft still didn't have enough speed to lift the nose off the ground. The tail of the KLM scraped against the runway. In the final moment before disaster struck, the aircraft began to lift off the ground, but it was already too late. Right after uttering a Dutch curse word, at 17 hours 6 minutes and 50 seconds, KLM's landing gear and engines plowed into the top fuselage. Its left wing sliced off Pan Am's vertical stabilizer, rendering the plane uncontrollable. KLM lost all lift and crashed back onto the runway, having just been fully refueled. Hundreds of thousands of liters of jet fuel erupted in flames. Fire crews had to use 5 tons of firefighting foam and 50,000 liters of water to extinguish the blaze. All passengers and crew aboard the KLM flight perished. The Pan Am aircraft also caught fire after impact. Only 70 people managed to escape. The burning fuselage, thick smoke engulfed Tenerife Airport. The scene resembled hell on earth. Among those who escaped the Pan Am aircraft, 9 later died due to severe injuries. A total of 583 people lost their lives, making this the deadliest aviation disaster in human history. During the accident investigation, the Dutch side disagreed with Spain's conclusion that Captain Van Zanten was solely responsible. They argued the airport was overcrowded, with too few controllers, and radio communications were full of interference. Air traffic controllers used vague language. The Pan Am crew failed to exit the runway correctly. In fact, in the cockpit recordings with the control tower, you can even hear soccer commentary, suggesting the controller might have been distracted while on duty. Another report from the Civil Pilots Association stated that Captain Van Zanten may have suffered from instructor syndrome. Years of working only on simulators might have led him to misjudge the difference between training and reality. This can't simply be dismissed as coincidence. It was fate when Van Zanten decided to take off. The human brain's selective attention mechanism filtered out any signals not directly related to the primary task. 3 separate warnings that could have prevented the crash were unconsciously discarded by his short-term memory. The unclear phrasing and non-standard wording from the controller made the warnings even more ambiguous, drifting into the background of thought, leaving only the focus on taking off right now. After the catastrophic Tenerife crash, a wave of aviation safety reforms was introduced. Today, all major airports around the world are equipped with ground radar systems to precisely track each aircraft's position in all weather conditions. During communication, pilots and controllers must strictly adhere to standardized phraseology to avoid any misunderstanding that could lead to accidents. Phrases like ready for takeoff, cleared for takeoff, or line up and wait are now strictly defined in meaning and usage. The concept of CRM, crew resource management, was first emphasized after this disaster and has completely changed cockpit collaboration. From a time when captains held absolute authority, today, every crew member is responsible for speaking up and offering input. When risk is detected, CRM improves crew coordination, enhances decision-making, and crucially prevents errors caused by reluctance to speak up or blind trust in superiors. Training programs in stress management, error recognition, and emergency response have also been added after the crash, becoming essential in pilot training. These reforms, to this day, continue to silently protect millions of passengers daily, making our skies safer than ever. The Tenerife disaster was one of the darkest moments in the history of aviation. We must never let these painful lessons be forgotten, and we certainly must not let the safety of the future continue to be paid for with irreparable losses that can never be undone.